Tonight, APTN Investigates is looking at the push to use more nuclear energy. It's part of Canada's plan to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Reporter Christopher Reed is here to tell us about nuclear revival. Chris, thanks for taking a few minutes today to speak with us. So this is an update of some previous work you've done, right?
Yes, I've added some new material about small modular nuclear reactors to a piece we did in 2020. Now, some politicians, even some people who call themselves environmentalists, are saying we need some nuclear power in the mix to help get us to net carbon zero, our goal for 2050. But nuclear energy still has its fundamental problem, which is what to do with the nuclear waste, which remains a potentially deadly radioactive danger for eons. So we're looking at what these small modular reactors they're talking about mean for Canada's plan to deal with that high-level nuclear waste.
Now, speaking of that, what exactly is Canada's plan for that?
Well, they want to put it about half a kilometer down into the bedrock of the Canadian Shield. And this federal agency, it's called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, is courting communities, Indigenous ones included, in two areas near Ignace, Ontario and near South Bruce, Ontario. So the NWMO, as they call themselves, is engaging with these communities in various ways. Part of that involves giving them money to consider the idea of building this $26 billion underground complex to store used nuclear fuel for an eternity. But hold on, wait a second, because one of the proposed small modular reactor designs wants to take some of that used nuclear fuel first and reuse it in their reactors. So this potentially changes the plan for the NWMO, maybe considerably.
All right, Chris, certainly looking forward to that tonight, and thanks for taking a few minutes with us.
Thank you.
Christopher Reed's Nuclear Revival airs tonight on APTN Investigates right after the national news.
Canada got into the nuclear industry on the ground floor. Much of the uranium used to develop the first nuclear bombs for the top-secret Manhattan Project was mined in Canada by Saulteaux Dene people in Delisle, Northwest Territories. And Chalk River, Canada's first nuclear reactor facility, was involved in producing plutonium for the Allied weapons program. Today, Canada no longer supplies uranium or plutonium for nuclear weaponry, and has signed the United Nations Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Canada's involvement in nuclear energy continues. At the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, we saw a growing push for the expansion of nuclear power because it's a carbon-free energy source. Currently, about 15% of all Canadian electricity is produced by 6 nuclear power plants. 5 in Ontario and 1 in New Brunswick. And the nuclear reactors at those plants produce nuclear waste that doesn't have a permanent home. And that's why Canada's nuclear energy industry is looking for partners. The search for a place to store our most toxic nuclear waste is the job of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, or NWMO. A not-for-profit corporation created by an act of Parliament, the NWMO is funded by Canada's nuclear industry players. Its goal is to find somewhere in the Canadian Shield willing to host Canada's growing collection of used nuclear fuel, which will remain radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years, but theoretically safe from the outside world in an underground facility that will eventually be sealed off. The concept is called a Deep Geological Repository, or DGR. And a big focus at the NWMO is engaging with Indigenous communities in areas under consideration for a DGR. Bob Watts is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations for the NWMO. He's long been a major player in Indigenous politics and has had high-level positions with the Assembly of First Nations and the federal government. Watts is Mohawk and Ojibwe and lives on the Six Nations Reserve.
From a safety point of view, I feel really good about it. I feel really good about living on top of where a DGR is, because I'm convinced of the safety case. I think there's a whole bunch of other social factors that would need to be taken into account in terms of our community and our rights and how that gets expressed more generally. But in terms of would I live where there's a deep geological repository, I think absolutely I would.
Watts isn't likely to have to live on top of a deep geological repository, but we asked him about that to test his belief in the safety of the concept. If a DGR is built, where it's located will depend in part on the support and consent the NWMO gets from the area's Indigenous people. The NWMO is currently engaging with communities in two areas in Ontario, Ignace and South Bruce. Exactly how much regional Indigenous support and consent will be needed to green-light the deep geological repository is unknown, according to Watts. What if something like this happens? What if the township of Ignace says go ahead, but one or more First Nations communities in the area say no way?
So one of the things that is going to be important to us, and in particular with respect to the scenario you've identified, is to have confidence that we can go ahead with the project. And in some of the areas we've identified Indigenous communities that may be in really close proximity to the project, and we've made it clear to those communities that we're not going to go ahead without their support. There may be other communities that may be further away from a proposed site that we'll need to work with communities and figure out what does that mean in terms of not being supportive. And we haven't got to that place yet, but we recognize that we're not going to have 100% support.
The NWMO trumpets its Indigenous partnership efforts proudly. They have an advisory council of Indigenous elders and youth, and have even produced an 8-part video series on reconciliation. So it would seem that respectful consultation is part of what the NWMO believes will be needed to convince Indigenous Canadians that a deep geological repository is the best plan for Canada's high-level nuclear waste. It's a plan Mark Gobian knows well.
I work for the Safety and Technical Research Department at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization.
And when we visited the NWMO, he showed us what will be going into the DGR.
So this here is a CANDU fuel bundle. This is what would actually go inside a nuclear reactor. When it comes out of the reactor, it actually looks exactly the same, except it would be quite hot thermally, and would also be radioactive. So this is an actual size block of what the bentonite buffer blocks would look like. It's wrapped in plastic right now. This is just to prevent it from any sort of deterioration while it's in storage here. And the room's at such high humidity to keep that clay material nice and moist so it doesn't dry out, crack, crumble.
Can I touch it?
Go ahead. So it's wrapped in plastic right now, but you can feel that it's quite strong. It's actually like a soapstone in terms of its strength and durability. The way that these are actually manufactured is we take bags and bags of bentonite powder, we place them inside a big mold, and then basically put that mold inside a really high pressure chamber that forces the block to come together. It's actually in a pressure cell where we manufacture these ones. It's actually a pressure cell where they test submarine components. Yeah.
The purpose of a DGR is to protect the environment from the radiation which will be emitted from the nuclear waste for a very long time. It potentially does that 3 ways. 1, by giving it time, that is, many hundreds of thousands of years for its radioactivity to decay. 2, by by putting a lot of distance between the waste and the surface environment, and 3, by shielding the waste with what the NWMO calls its multiple barrier system. By the NWMO's theory, multiple barriers should eliminate any possibility of the nuclear fuel being moved back into our environment via water.
So this is an example of one of our copper-coated containers that the fuel would actually go into underground.
The first barrier in the NWMO's multiple barrier system is the fuel pellet itself. The pellet is a high-density ceramic made from uranium dioxide powder and does not readily dissolve in water. The second barrier is the fuel element and the fuel bundle. The tubes or fuel elements contain the fuel pellets and are made of a corrosion-resistant metal called zircaloy. The third barrier is the used fuel container. The NWMO's container will hold 48 used fuel bundles, and it's composed of a steel structure which the NWMO says can withstand the pressures of the overlying rock and loading from a 3-kilometer thick glacier during a future ice age. The container is also coated in a thin layer of corrosion-resistant copper. Barrier 4 is bentonite clay. Each used fuel container would be encased in a casket-like box made of bentonite clay. Bentonite clay is a barrier to water flow because it swells when exposed to water. As well as the bentonite clay casket surrounding the used fuel container, open spaces in each underground chamber will also be filled with bentonite clay. Barrier 5 is the geosphere, that is, the sedimentary or crystalline rock formation into which the DGR will be excavated. So as Mark Gobian and the NWMO see it, a lot would have to fail before water could access the used fuel and cause problems for us on the surface.
In order to get any sort of release of radioactive material, you'd have to have that water move through the rock. It'd also have to move through our clay bentonite barrier. It would also have to somehow penetrate our steel and copper canister that's very durable and corrosion resistant, as well as penetrate these bundles and dissolve that fuel itself, which is a ceramic material. It's extremely durable.
It all sounds very safe and well thought out. That is, maybe until you hear from the guy who's probably the nuclear industry's most prominent critic in Canada.
We should admit that underground repositories have failed and that this one might fail.
More on that after the break.
The NWMO wanted to organize a meeting with the Inuit. The Inuit said, no. You give us the money, we'll organize the meeting. Yeah. And they took the money and they invited Bob and I, as well as the NWMO people.
Gordon Edwards is the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He also works on a radioactive task force with the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus. We met December 2019 in Peterborough, Ontario, where he's giving a talk at a school about what's going on at a factory right across the street.
These school children here at Prince of Wales School, behind them, very close, is a factory. You see that smokestack there. That factory produces uranium fuel bundles for use in the CANDU reactor.
Edwards has an academic background in math, physics, and chemistry. And with a PhD attached to his name, he's held his own as perhaps the biggest thorn in the side of the Canadian nuclear industry. At one point, even defeating Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, in a 1974 episode of The Great Debate, hosted by Pierre Burton.
There are several good ways to incorporate them, let us say, into rods, which are not unbreakable, but which will not pulverize if broken, and then put these rods into strong containers. If you break such a container, you have a nuisance, not a catastrophe.
I would like to bring out just a minute. Dr. Teller makes the point that you could put it all in rods, put the rods in containers, presumably bury them, and in his view, that makes it safe. For the
let me tell you a bit, Pierre, about the history of waste storage in the United States. In 1969, the United States General Accounting Office reported that there were 93 million gallons of high-level waste stored underground in 3 states, These are in stainless steel and concrete containers which have their own cooling systems, and they said that these things would have to be cooled and guarded for more than 600 years.
Dr. Teller, do you want to comment on that?
They also said that 18 of these tanks have been found to be defective within the last 25 years, and some 227,000 gallons of high-level waste have already escaped into the soil.
Edwards says the nuclear industry is being dishonest in presenting the deep geological repository concept as a certain and safe solution.
So we are facing a situation where we have an industry that wants to convince people by hocus pocus that it has solved a problem that it has created, which is beyond its power to resolve. It does not have the power to solve this problem. We should begin with a process of honesty. We should admit that underground repositories have failed and that this one might fail.
Canada is not alone in pursuing a deep geological repository. Many other countries are working toward implementing a DGR as their long-term solution for dealing with nuclear waste. But as Edwards sees it, there are issues.
I think it's an interesting concept that's had a lot of work done on it, but the difficulty is that so far we have no evidence that it works. In fact, in Germany, there were 2 deep geological repositories for radioactive waste, which have both failed. They found out for the last 20 years, this waste has been leaking into the groundwater and reaching the surface water and contaminating the environment.
And then there's the eons a DGR is meant to keep us safe from this material. Humans have simply never built anything that's lasted as long as a deep geological repository needs to last.
You have to realize that the pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old. Go and look at them. They're really deteriorated a great deal. The half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years. The Great Lakes didn't even exist 24,000 years ago. So we're talking about periods of time that dwarf the span of human history.
But what could go wrong if, say, we're entombing this material in bedrock that hasn't shifted significantly for a couple of billion years?
We do not know how to put a geological formation back together again. Whoever saw a mountain being mined and then reassembled back into the original integrity that it had before it was disturbed. We cannot put waste into an undisturbed geological formation because we are going to disturb it. When we disturb the geological formation, it's no longer undisturbed. Now, when you excavate a cavity underground, you create a room which is at atmospheric pressure, but the surrounding rock is at geological pressure, which is far greater than the atmospheric pressure. The result is that these repositories are all going to be flooded with water without fail, because the pressure differential between the rock and the space is going to be filled with water.
Even with the problem of what to do with nuclear waste not yet resolved, there are plans afoot for a revival of an industry that has been largely in decline. More on that after the break. As one debate continues over how to deal with our nuclear waste, another nuclear debate is emerging. Because as climate change ramps up and shows us the new reality, some leaders are pushing for more nuclear, in an approach they say could help get us to net zero emissions by 2050. In Canada, it's called the SMR Action Plan. Canada and other countries are investing in developing small modular reactors, or SMRs for short. As then Minister of Natural Resources Seamus O'Regan told the Canadian Nuclear Association in 2020.
We are placing nuclear energy front and center, something that has never been done before.
According to the federal government, there's no path to net zero without nuclear. And currently the federal government is involved in assisting the development of a number of SMR proposals. Rory O'Sullivan is the CEO of Moltex Canada, a company that's been given $50.5 million to develop its small modular reactor concept.
If we want to get to net zero by 2050, it's pretty clear that even though there's a lot of challenges with nuclear, we need nuclear power to be part of the mix to supplement renewable power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
And Moltex wants to use spent nuclear fuel from the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station in New Brunswick in their SMR.
And instead of putting it in the ground where it'll be radioactive for very long periods, we can reuse it as fuel to create more clean energy from what was waste. We can't get rid of the waste altogether, but the aim is to get it down to about 1,000th of the volume of the original long-lived radioactivity.
But not so fast, says Gordon Edwards. Moltex would like its SMR to be used around the world, and that makes Edwards uneasy.
Now, Moltex claims that because the plutonium is not being separated all by itself, because it's also separating out these other heavier than uranium isotopes, that therefore it shouldn't be a problem for weapons, because you need to get pure plutonium to really be able to make a good nuclear weapon. But they've already done most of the work.
Moltex, on the other hand, says its process does not involve extracting plutonium.
What we're actually doing is we are not extracting plutonium. Extracting plutonium would not be possible in Canada. Plutonium on its own is a very dangerous, hazardous material. What we are doing is taking out all of the long-lived radioactive waste of the spent fuel, which is only about 0.5%. So it includes the plutonium, but it's all the other contaminants as well. We don't go near plutonium separation.
But Edwards says Moltex is going close enough to plutonium separation for it to be a problem. Hugh Akagi is chief of the Passamaquoddy Nation, which counts the Point Lepreau facility as part of its traditional territory. And like Edwards, Akagi has concerns.
Well, I don't feel very good about it, to be honest. You paid that money. If you pay tax on anything in this country, you've just made a donation to Moltex. If you're not concerned about $50 million being turned over to a corporation for a technology that does not exist, I hope you heard me correctly on that.
But what could small modular reactors mean for the NWMO and their plans? Derek Wilson is Vice President of Construction and Projects for the NWMO, and he knows there are a lot of potential variables that could come into play, including plans to use enriched uranium in some of the SMR designs.
Until we have more information on the actual fuel type, the configuration of the fuel, and how that fuel would be received, it's difficult to say how the enrichment would impact our DGR.
Enriched uranium has the potential to go critical or accidentally chain react.
It comes down to the criticality and the ability to be able to manage the criticality for the enrichment. So, until we understand a bit more about the volumes, the level of enrichment, it's difficult to say that, X, Y, Z is the solution.
And remember, the NWMO plans to put used nuclear fuel in its multiple barrier system. So another issue they're faced with is the fact that fuel bundles employed by new SMR designs will likely be different.
They're going to have to start from square one and develop new plans to accommodate these other fuels. There is a variety of different types, and each one of these reactors has a different type of fuel and consequently a different geometry and a different requirement for packaging.
Wilson says this is an issue being considered by the NWMO.
Can the vendor produce, a fuel waste that we would receive that could go into our container? So is there processing, or can they configure their fuel in such a way that we could actually incorporate it into our used fuel container design? That's probably the simplest.
Clearly, the question at the center of all this is about the safety and viability of nuclear energy as a way to help us get to net zero emissions. And it's a question some are asking the new Environment Minister. The Ministry of Environment and Climate is listed as one of the federal entities supporting the SMR Action Plan. But Minister Stephen Guilbeault is a former activist with Greenpeace who once scaled the CN Tower in a climate change protest. Greenpeace is against nuclear power and SMRs, and as recently as 2018, Guilbeault tweeted, "It's time to close Pickering nuclear plant and go for renewables." And in an encounter at COP26 with Dr. Chris Kiefer, the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, who asked him to comment on the fact that the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is now presenting nuclear in a positive light, Guilbeault wouldn't reveal his personal stance.
Have you reevaluated your position based on the scientific consensus on that? Based on the IPCC saying wind and solar are not enough, we need nuclear.
what I've said publicly since I've been here, it won't be up to government to decide which technologies will flourish.
But again, you've had a strong position in the past, so I'm just asking, has that changed based upon the scientific consensus of the IPCC that all 4 decarbonization pathways call for an increase in nuclear energy?
I think I've answered your question.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't think you have, but that's okay.
They say money speaks louder than words, and Kiefer might not have been able to get an answer from Guilbeault at COP26, but the money that the government Guilbeault represents is investing in companies like Moltex makes a statement all on its own, even if Guilbeault can't quite bring himself to say it with his own mouth too. But words or no words, Hugh Akagi is listening.
How come we can't get $1 million to protect the future? Is going to be thousands of years of nuclear waste.